So I wanna circle back to the points you were making about the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and I think probably most people listening are by now familiar with the laundry list of fallacies that and biases that the human brain is subject to. And I just want to sort of reiterate the point you're making here, which is a very interesting one. And it's that many of the ways in which we can shown to be irrational on these word problems given to us, it's the sunk cost fallacy, for instance, is a common one. All of these kinds of fallacies, sometimes the source of our mistake is not that we're stupid. It's actually that we're smart our minds have made us smart by using shortcuts that are highly efficient in many practical scenarios. But a clever researcher can find what that shortcut, the corner that shortcut is skirting around, and drill down on that corner in a way that reveals the trade-off of that shortcut. And that really reframes the whole cognitive bias literature, or the whole behavioral economic literature. The lesson to take turns from, wow, look how poorly evolved we are to reason effectively in the modern world, to look how really ingenious our brains are at solving many practical problems that can be sort of foiled in relatively narrow scenarios, some of which matter to some of which are very important to realize. But the lesson is not that we're irrational fundamentally. It's actually, in some sense, the opposite. It's that the ways in which we are rational are deep and highly useful in the real world, but can be exploited in experiments. Is that right?
I think that's right. And it is a point that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman themselves made now and again to their credit, although often that literature is kind of explained or passed down as just a number of ways you can poke fun at our species, or at the ordinary schlub who can get caught in all of these fallacies. And you're right, first of all, that many of them are ways of reasoning that depend on certain assumptions and that work serviceably well when those assumptions are satisfied, but that can be kind of caught out if you cleverly change the problem so that those assumptions don't hold. And there are some times in which the problems, you might have to even give the problem a second thought, because sometimes human intuition might even be more rational than the psychologist who's trying to catch us in illusions. I'll give you an example. So here's a typical or a famous kind of fallacy. If I say that Amanda is very sensitive, has a highly refined aesthetic sense, she loves poetry, she wrote a sonnet for her boyfriend for his birthday, she has traveled to Italy, what's more likely, that she is an art history major or a psychology major? Everyone says, oh, an art history major, obviously. Now, there are probably 100 psychology majors for every art history major. So no matter how much she fits the stereotype of an art history major, just the raw base rates, the law of averages, the luck of the draw would say she's more likely to be a psychology major. So that's a fallacy, sometimes called base rate neglect. That is, people reason by stereotype. Tversky and Coleman called it the representativeness heuristic, rather than by Bayes' rule, which says you always start with the base rate. That is, what's the prevalence in the population? So you can say, oh, people fall for this fallacy. They can't apply Bayes' rule. But there is a twist, which is that the Bayesian logic in terms of starting with the base rate only applies if the person was picked at random from the population. That is, I've chosen Amanda at random from the entire student body, with its 100 times as many psychology students majors as art history majors. But a person, if you don't tell people that, or if you don't emphasize it, then the person figuring out might think, well, why am I hearing all about her, her travel tastes and her, what she gave her boyfriend? Surely an intelligent conversational partner is telling me that for a reason. Namely, she wasn't picked at random. The only reason we're getting that character description is for me to connect the dots, read between the lines, which is, of course, highly intelligent, highly rational in ordinary conversation. That's the reason why it's so infuriating to talk to a chatbot on a helpline, because it takes you so literally and doesn't read between the lines. We do read between the lines. We assume that someone is presenting us information for a sensible purpose, such as I'm telling you about Amanda because that is diagnostic information about the kind of person that she is. And so the Bayesian base rate actually doesn't apply if she's selected at random. And indeed, follow-up studies, some done by Tversky and Kahneman themselves, but pursued further by Gigerenzer, shows that if you really rub people's faces in how random the selection process is, that is, if you pick Amanda's description out of a jar with a bunch of student descriptions, then people don't fall for the fallacy anymore. So that would be an example of how people are not as foolish. And as you say, some of our demonstrations are not exactly fair to the ordinary human Joe or Jill.
Yeah, I've even thought at times that the hot hand fallacy or the gambler's fallacy is maybe not quite so much a fallacy as it seems, and that this is just the idea. The hot hand fallacy is usually described as the false belief that, say, if a basketball player just made his last shot, that he is more likely to make the next shot because he has a hot hand, when in reality it's whatever his field goal percentage is, that's going to be the same on the next throw. And I can see how that could be narrowly true if defined as just based on whether he made the last shot. But intuitively, as someone who plays sports and basketball and also other skills like music and chess, just like intuitively, your level of skill actually with certain skills can vary quite dramatically from day to day. Even as a speaker, right? I notice some days I'm just I'm mellifluous. The words just come out.
Oh,
and other days it's,
tell me about it. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And you can sort of understand. You can understand certain elements, like if I tend to sleep more, I tend to be better. But certain aspects of it just remain mysterious, I think, forever. And so the intuition that if someone is having a good day on the team, that you give them the ball is not, that it's actually deeply rational for many kinds of skills, if not most kinds of skills. And it's only a fallacy to the extent that your likelihood of success is deeply random and doesn't follow any kind of daily swing or pattern. So I've often thought that was a fallacy that was overplayed a little bit.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because in the book I talk about the hot hand fallacy, which is that there is no hot hand. It turns out there is a hot hand.
Yeah.
So there was the kind of analogy of the gambler's fallacy, which is that if a roulette wheel, say, lands on red 6 times in a row, people think it's due for a black. Now and what you engaged in talking about the fact that, we have our ups, we have our downs, we have good days, we have bad days, and don't I know there sometimes when I do an interview and afterwards I think, oh God, I was really inarticulate that day, and then other times it just seems to flow, and that it would be no surprise if that happened to basketball players, as you noted. And that makes it different in terms of just your understanding of the underlying causal model compared to the roulette wheel, where it would be a shock if the gambler's fallacy was not a fallacy, because the roulette wheel doesn't have a memory. And it's not as if the roulette wheel has a desire to appear fair, like, oh, I've landed, on red 6 times in a row. I better start coughing up some blacks, otherwise I'll violate the law of averages, and I can't do that. I'm a roulette wheel. So we know that doesn't happen with roulette wheels. And so that's how we know that the gambler's fallacy has pretty much got to be a fallacy. If it wasn't a fallacy, we'd say that the roulette wheel must have been fixed. And as Tversky and Kahneman point out, in the gambler's fallacy and similar fallacies with coin flips kind of come from a misunderstanding of randomness and of the so-called law of averages, more accurately, the law of large numbers, which is that as the size of a sample increases, its parameters come to resemble the ones of the population from which it was drawn. But the reason that happens isn't because of a process of compensation. That is, if the samples start to veer too much in one direction, there's a force that pulls them, back towards the middle. That's not how it works. It's a process of dilution. Namely, if it veers too much in one direction, which it inevitably will, because a random walk does tend to veer in a certain direction, then more and more stuff will kind of drown it out, will dilute it, and it'll tend to regress toward the average. However, as you note, the underlying causal model for basketball players isn't like that. Yeah, I mean, we are not roulette wheels physically. Our physical state does get carried over from moment to moment. So there it's completely an empirical question whether basketball players are roulette wheels, although it's kind of the gambler's fallacy in reverse, because you're more likely to make a shot rather than more likely to do the opposite, as in the case of the roulette wheel. But it's the same logic. And so that's one of the reasons why the claim by Tom Gilovich and Amos Tversky that there is no hot hand, namely that basketball players really are roulette wheels, was so shocking to sports fans and to kind of common sense. It turns out that Tversky and Gilovich probably did the statistics wrong, that by identifying streaks of hits or misses after the fact, they're kind of biasing the data against a continuation of the streak. Because let's say you make a shot, 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 5 successful attempts in a row. Well, it's almost by definition that the next one is going to be a miss, because if the next one was a hit, you could have called it a streak of 6 shots instead of 5 shots. And therefore, your delineation of the data is in part biased by whether there was a flip or not. So it's a subtle statistical point. It would have to be for someone as brilliant as Tversky to have missed it. But it's one that throws off the calculations. And so it turns out that common sense, conventional wisdom, sports fans' understanding turns out to be right. And the kind of the gotcha gang, the ones trying to show how foolish and misled sports fans were, turned out to be wrong. So that's why I call it the hot hand fallacy.